Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Hallett. I'm a professor at IE University and I teach in the Masters in Visual and Digital Media. I teach advertising and branded content strategy and creation, and as well as photography and video production. And I also teach at IE in the International MBA. I teach electives on going from brands to images. When I'm not teaching, I'm a photographer, a director. I work in branded content, online branded content creation and advertising projects for my clients here in Spain and abroad. So, to begin with, I'd like to just say that I'm glad that you're here. This is a very interesting time, if we can call it that, for all of us. This time that we're going through right now. And so, what I'd like to look at today, and in this liquid learning lab that we're going to be going through together, is what is it that drives human innovation? Where does discovery and innovation actually come from? And if we look at the situation we're in right now, we often talk about the new normal, but we talk about the new normal as if it were going to kind of arrive on our doorstep right now, right? So if we look at the changes that are happening in our lives right now, what we see is that there are certain people and certain companies that are able to adapt more quickly, and with more innovation to be able to survive this crisis. And I think that also happens on a personal level. In other words, we're going through an experience where all of a sudden we're maybe working from home or studying from home. We're cooking more at home. We're going out less. We see people less. Now we have more experiences online. And so we're also shifting as individuals, right? And I believe that the new normal is something that is not just going to arrive on our doorstep one day. The new normal is something that we're all creating and innovating together. So in your work, in your studies, in your life, in your personal life, you're making all of these changes and adjustments. And so the new normal is going to come from all of those innovations that we're experiencing right now. But the important thing for me is that we're all part of it. In other words, you have to also look at your own life, your own work, and say, what are the things that I can do? How can I change and adapt to this new situation? So what this liquid learning lab is designed to do is to take us through this idea of what is the X factor? What is it that actually drives innovation? And then we're going to look at a specific case study, which is the hospitality industry. So we're going to look at how can hotel companies, Airbnb, restaurants, travel, et cetera, how can they create the new normal? How can they adapt to this situation? The hospitality industry is without a doubt one of the hardest hit industries right now. And so the question is, if you were the CEO of Airbnb or of a hotel company, what would you do right now to adjust and adapt to this new situation, to create a new customer experience, to make people feel safe and comfortable enough that they'll come back and use your company again, right? And so the way that this liquid learning lab is designed is that first I'm going to present you with this video, and then you have a document which gives you a few short articles, which I'd like you to read. Those articles will take about 15 minutes for you to read. They're pretty short. And then there's a series of questions that I'd like you to think about. And basically those questions are, if you were the CEO of one of these hospitality companies, what would you do right now, right? And I'd like you to think about those questions and write down some notes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to join together online for a discussion where I want you to bring your ideas, your questions, your thoughts, and we're going to put it all together and have this discussion together and see what it is that we come up with. So this is what the Liquid Learning Lab is designed to do. Again, I'd like to welcome you. And without further ado, let's jump into the X Factor. So the X Factor is essentially asking the question, what is it that differentiates the most innovative people that we see around us, the people who discover and change? And if you look at the situation that we're in right now, you'll see that there are certain companies, certain businesses, certain industries that are able to to adapt and change, and there are others that are essentially dying off. So the question that I find the most interesting is, why are those particular companies, who are the people who are behind those innovations and those discoveries? And so my hope is that by going through this liquid learning lab, that you will discover that you can actually be part of creating the new normal, because the new normal is not going to arrive one day. The new normal is something that we're actually going to create, right? And so the question is, what can each of us do within our own lives, within our work, within our own education and learning, to actually adapt? So if I were to ask you the question, what have you learned in the last 90 days? We've all suddenly experienced, maybe you've stayed at home a lot, during this time. Maybe you've been working from home or studying from home. Suddenly you're cooking more at home. But then we've learned all these things. We've learned about viruses. We've learned about how to protect ourselves in terms of wearing masks and cleaning our hands and social distancing. And there are all these things happening, but we're all adapting. And so it's an interesting thing if you think about, in the last 30 days, that basically the entire planet has gone through this very extreme learning process. So what actually forced this change? Well, what forced this change in us was the change in our environment, and that provokes when as animals, when we're faced with change, it produces uncertainty, fear, doubt, and even the struggle for survival. And so we've all experienced that anxiety, that fear of survival right now. And so essentially what we want to do is look at, why does that happen? So it's an interesting thing if you look at, when did we actually begin to research about the coronavirus, because we knew that the coronavirus actually existed back in November, December is when we really first heard about it. And so what I did was I went online and I looked at different countries, China, Italy, and I asked et cetera, and I asked the question, when did these countries actually begin to explore? So I went into Google Analytics and I looked for the word disinfect. And what I found was that in China, the peak of that is actually around February. Now, you know that in China, China had an outbreak in much earlier than that. But so what you see is that there's kind of this delay reaction until people actually start to research. And the same thing in France. France was even later. France began to study these questions. People began to search for answers. Not until March, right? And by March, it was obviously too late. And Australia is the same thing. Australia began to ask around the same time as France. So this is when all of a sudden we realize that we need to learn. And so that provokes in us this desire to search, to educate, to gain knowledge, right? So this question is, when do we react to circumstances? Do we react early when we can still adapt to them? Do we react just on time when we maybe have suffered a little bit, the changes, but we can still recover? Or do we react too late when we're already overwhelmed? And so we can apply this idea of what we searched for in terms of the coronavirus to businesses. When are businesses going to really react? Are businesses waiting to see what happens, or are they actually making those changes now, right? So the X factor is that thing which causes us as human beings to look for information when we're faced with all of these extenuating circumstances, right? So if we look at an example to see what is the X factor. So there's the story of, I find this fascinating, the story of the Swiss engineer, Georges de Mestral, who was hunting in the mountains in Switzerland, and he was hunting with his dog. And what happened was that he, when he came back from going out into the forest with his dog, he discovered that his dog had what are called burrs, and burrs are sort of a plant with little spikes on them, which is what you see in the photo. His dog had these burrs in its fur, and so what he did was, he could have simply removed them, right? But he was fascinated by the fact that these burrs were sticking in the dog's fur. So what he did was he took them and he put them under a microscope to actually see what is the element in this plant that allows it to stick into the dog's fur. And as a result of that, of course, many of you may know this story, but the result of that was that he then invented Velcro, right? And so it was, he could have at the moment that he discovered these burrs in his dog's fur, he could have simply set it aside, and instead he was actually motivated to go in and figure out what was going on. So the question is, what is it that drives people to do that? Certain people actually attack problems in this way, which is to try to get more information. And if we look at all of these, these innovative people in history, Elon Musk, Marie Curie, Steve Jobs, Helen Keller, Bill Gates, Amelia Earhart, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, what is it that actually makes these people so powerful? Are they just naturally gifted? Do they just come up with bright ideas? Or is there something that we all possess, which they simply take advantage of? And the answer is that it is curiosity. Curiosity is the core of all innovation. So I think for me, curiosity is a fascinating thing because when I look back at my own learning and development as a photographer, my mother gave me a camera when I was a manual, camera with black and white film in it when I was about 9 years old, and that really spiked my curiosity. And so I began to investigate at a young age what this little machine was capable of. And so curiosity is the fountain of everything else. Curiosity is the fountain of creativity. It's the fountain of design, the fountain of innovation, and the fountain of discovery. So, think about the average CEO. The average CEO reads 52 books a year. So these are people who are essentially constantly trying to build their own knowledge. Albert Einstein said, "I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious." He was also pretty smart as well, but he was curious, and it was his curiosity that drove him to learn. So let's look for a minute at why human beings are actually so curious. What is it about us that differentiates us from the rest of the animal kingdom? Where does curiosity come from? So if we look at early human beings, the early Homo sapien was not actually a very powerful creature. A chimpanzee versus a single human being in a fight, the chimpanzee would have torn the human being or the Homo sapien limb from limb, right? So what happened to human beings is that we began to gather information, and the more information that we had about our environment, the more likely we were to survive and reproduce. And so evolution gave us curiosity. You can say in a way that curiosity is the greatest invention of the evolutionary process. It's also the thing that has created atomic weapons. And so we know that curiosity is not always a positive thing necessarily. Human curiosity also leads to a lot of destruction. It's the most powerful element in evolution. It's also the most dangerous thing for the planet and for our own existence, right? So curiosity essentially comes when we feel a need, when we have a desire or a want or some missing element or void, an unexpected situation, or a potential threat. And these are the things that spark our curiosity. So what's interesting about curiosity is that as human beings developed, there are essentially three things that spark our curiosity. Those are food, sex, and shelter. And so initially, those were the things that we needed. But as we developed, the caudate nucleus, which is a very small part in our brain, which is actually what emits dopamine. And dopamine, of course, is our pleasure center, right? So curiosity is the thing that provokes most our response, our dopamine response. The other things that provoke that, of course, are sex and food. So sex, food, and curiosity are the three things that really drove human evolution. So what is curiosity? Curiosity is essentially the state of mind which allows us to handle uncertainty in our lives with a positive attitude, right? So we respond to these situations and we say, "Oh, I can overcome this. I'm going to get the information I need, and I'm going to get through this," right? So curiosity is essentially a motivated desire for information. Animals also possess curiosity, but their curiosity is what we call diversive curiosity. In other words, a cat, for example, has curiosity. If you throw a red ball into a room with a cat, the cat will slowly make its way to the red ball. And once it figures out that it's not dangerous, it might play with it for a while. But what the animal doesn't have is what's called epistemic curiosity. And epistemic curiosity is the desire for deeper knowledge. So a cat will never look up at the stars and wonder, what are those, right? Or the moon, what is the moon? And that's where human beings are actually different from the rest of the animals. And the other thing that human beings did, and we're going to look at this because it absolutely ties into innovation and discovery within business, is that we then added storytelling to this. And so what happened was that we not only gathered information, but then we shared it. And so the written language, the spoken language were all our means of sharing the information that we had gathered, learning, copying, imitating, sharing, and improving. And so you combine curiosity with storytelling, and all of a sudden you have Homo sapiens, you have the modern human. So curiosity is the need to answer questions. Storytelling, what it does is it poses questions, it opens situations, and it shares knowledge. So we combine these two powerful elements together, and that's what makes us so incredible. And if you look at storytelling in the age of the coronavirus, of course we know that all kinds of information is being shared, right? People are every day there's something new coming out. There's some new element, some new discovery, conversation, memes on the internet, et cetera, both true information and false information, of course. But what we're doing is we're essentially doing the storytelling part of human information sharing. We are essentially informivores, which means that knowledge is essential to our survival and our reproduction, right? And that's the evolution that we're looking at now. So what is curiosity? If we look at curiosity, as knowledge comes, as we gain knowledge, right? From a new or an unexpected situation, as we gain knowledge, our curiosity is actually piqued. And that means that the more information that we get, the more interested we are. But what's also interesting is that human beings, if you look at this graph, what happens with human beings is that we reach a point at which we become saturated with information, and then we think we know enough, and then our curiosity actually begins to go away, right? So if you think about what you were searching for 2 or 3 months ago in this new situation, now what's happening is that you have stopped searching that because you think you have enough knowledge. So that brings us to this next element of this, which is questions. So questions are then a technology that human beings use to draw insights. And questions are incredibly important because, as we'll see as we move forward in this video, you'll see that the kinds of questions that we ask are incredibly important in terms of the kinds of information that we get and the kinds of innovations that we do. So we also have to think about how we formulate questions, both in terms of us as being a part of a team, but also as leaders. In other words, if you're in charge of a team, what are the kinds of questions that you would ask the team right now to get the kinds of innovation that you're looking for? So curiosity has 4 different elements. There's diversive, perceptual, empathic, and epistemic. This is just a little bit of information. We're interested in the last one, which is epistemic, which is essentially the core to our discovery. So epistemic curiosity is a directed attempt to build understanding. It's what happens to diversive curiosity when it grows up. So diversive curiosity is kind of like that feeling you get, for example, when you go onto social media and you're scrolling through YouTube or Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn, whatever, and that's diversive. Diversive means that it's constantly changing, and so your dopamine, your brain is giving you little dopamine shots every time you're seeing a new meme or a new post or whatever. But what we want to do is grow that up and take it to epistemic. Now, when we're born, essentially the entire world is unknown to us, right? In other words, we don't have any information when we're born, and so what we have are essentially unknown unknowns, right? That sounds a little weird, but essentially what that means is we don't know anything, and we don't even know what we don't know, right? And as we grow, as children, you will see children ask questions. Children ask more than 100 questions a day. What is this? What is that? Why does this do that? Why does this happen, right? And so what happens is that children then begin to build their knowns, and they also become aware of the fact that there are areas that they don't even know about, right? Which are the unknowns, or they know that it's there, but they don't understand it, right? And then outside of that are still the unknown unknowns, which are essentially those areas that are out there, but they're not even aware that they don't know about it, right? And that's the area where the innovation happens. So as knowledge is gained, our neural pathways become faster and they become automatic, so that we gain memory, muscle reflexes, information comes into our brain immediately through these pathways. But the result is that we also at the same time become somewhat lazy. I don't know if you've ever talked to a person who's a know-it-all, but you talk to a know-it-all, and it's horrible because they think they know everything, and they're not interested in learning anything new. They're not interested in listening, right? So curiosity, the important thing here is that it's not a trait. It's not a trait that some people have and some people don't. It's a state of mind. It's more like a muscle. So you can actually stretch your curiosity. You can exercise it and build strength and agility. And that's where we are right now. That's what we need to begin to do, is to exercise our curiosity. And the more you use it, the stronger it gets, right? So eventually what happens is that we end up with incurious people who think that they know everything, and they think that there's very little that they don't know, and they have no idea what's beyond that. So this is the incurious person. The curious person, which is the Jeff Bezos and the Steve Jobs and all these people, are people who know a lot, but they're also very aware of what they don't know. And they're even aware that there are things out there that they have no idea that even exist. And that's what fascinates them. That's what makes them explorers and innovators. So if we look at the situation that we're in right now, what we can say is that we're actually in a time of tremendous opportunity. So what are the opportunities for innovation right now, and where are those opportunities going to come from? They're essentially going to come from those that area of the unknown unknown. So if we look at what we know right now, this is what we already do. And if we look at what are the unknowns, these are things maybe that we are repurposing towards. In other words, I'm going to take what I do, but I'm going to shift it right now. For example, if you look at restaurants, a lot of restaurants, because they couldn't have large numbers of people in their restaurants, what they did was they shifted more and more to home delivery. So this is repurposing. And then the last thing where innovation and discovery happens is where we really begin to think about, what are the things out there that I could learn from that I don't even know exist. And so once you spread your imagination and your questions out into that area, that's where you're going to begin to discover. If we look at Steve Jobs, it's interesting because Steve Jobs was a person who was incredibly curious. Steve Jobs was interested in the Bauhaus movement, architecture and art. He was interested in the poetry of the Beat movement in the United States, Eastern philosophy, the workings of business, the lyrics of Bob Dylan, the biology of the digestive system. He had a very, very broad range of interest. And if you look at we talk about Leonardo da Vinci as someone who was not only an artist, but an inventor. Well, this is somebody who had interests that were very, very broad. And so he was able to connect lots of ideas together. So if we look at curiosity leadership, in other words, as a leader, the key question here is, what kinds of questions promote curiosity? How do I stoke curiosity within the people who work with me? And that brings us to an idea which is called fail forward. Now, fail forward essentially means that I'm going to stretch out into these unknown unknowns, and I'm going to accept the fact that I might actually have some failure. But every time we have failure, you might have heard this, that when we have failure, the learning is actually the most important thing, right? So Steve Jobs, for example, Steve Jobs was fired from his job as the CEO of Apple, right? He started the company, then he was fired. He eventually went back, right? But it was that failure, that moment of failure, which actually drove him then into his biggest successes. If we look at the example, for example, of the Titanic, right? Well, the Titanic, what happened with the Titanic was that, essentially people were not asking the right questions. In the Titanic tragedy, the team that was designing and building and piloting the Titanic, a lot of people had doubts. But there was not an environment in which people were allowed to question. This was supposed to be a ship that was unsinkable, people were told. And of course, many people thought, well, there could be an accident, right? So if we look at the kinds of questions that we can use, Sakichi Toyoda, who's the founder of Toyota Industries, the automobile um, company, he had a system that he called the 5 whys. And so what he would do is when he discovered that there was a problem or a situation that needed correcting, he would begin to ask why. And he wouldn't just ask why one time, he would actually ask it 5 times. And so I'll show you an example of this. So the first question might be, why do you exercise? And the answer is, well, because it's healthy, right? But you say, well, why is it healthy? Because it takes my heart rate up. Why is that important? So that I burn calories. Why do you want to do that? To lose weight. Why do you want to lose weight? I feel social pressure to look fit. And so what happens is that you see that as you dig, you actually get to the core issue. The core issue is the social pressure, right? And but it requires that questioning process in order to get to that actual answer. So on the counter side, we can say, well, what is it that actually inhibits curiosity? What is it that stops us from being curious? And the answer is we can divide this up essentially into 4 different areas. The first is that we have certain assumptions, right? So we make assumptions about a situation, and therefore we are not curious because we think that we actually know everything about it. The environment plays a factor. What environment are we in? What work environment are we in that allows us to either be curious or not be curious? Technology, we're faced with, we live in a world in which we're told that answers are available all the time. All you need to do is search online. And so we kind of depend on technology in so many ways to solve problems that we don't actually look for different kinds of solutions. And the last one is fear, and that is fear of change. And so right now, the really critical thing that we need to do both as individuals as well as companies is to not be afraid to change. In other words, we need to allow the change to happen. We need to look for the solutions, and then we need to venture into them. So in terms of curiosity leadership, adversity is essentially what leads to growth. So when we're faced with a challenge, that's the opportunity that we have to change and grow. So it's interesting when I'd like to know, I'd like you to think about this. If we know that questioning is a starting point for innovation, then why don't businesses embrace it more? Right? In other words, if questioning and examining the mistakes or the problems that we have, being open to those changes, if that's where innovation comes from, why don't businesses do it? And of course, the answer is that businesses have always done things a certain way. They want to continue to do things that way, and that's what has made them successful. So the more successful that a company becomes, the greater the danger of failure. And the reason is that whatever made them successful in the past, they believe that that's going to continue to make them successful in the future. If you think about the situation that we're in right now with creating the new normal, you know that businesses need to adapt and change. And so this is that critical moment when even businesses that have been successful, they need to alter their course. Blockbuster Video is a fantastic example. Blockbuster Video in the United States, they essentially rented DVDs, right? So we're talking in the 80s and 90s. They rented DVDs. People would take the DVDs home, watch the DVD, and then take it back. They were offered at one point to buy into Netflix. And at that time, they said, no, we have a super successful model. We're fine. We don't believe in online content viewing. We're going to stick with the model that we have. And what happened? Blockbuster Video went out of business, and now Netflix has hundreds of millions of subscribers around the world. So the past leader versus the future leader. The past leader was essentially looking at providing fixes and solutions. They didn't want to ask questions. They wanted to remain safe and try to project confidence. So a leader in the past would often, I'm sure you've had bosses like this. They wouldn't want to ask a question to the people who work for them because they were afraid of looking stupid. The idea was that, a boss always has to have the answers, right? And if the boss doesn't have the answers, if the boss has to go to the people who work for him or her to get the answers, then it shows weakness. Well, the future leader chooses new paths, is looking for new paths, is asking questions, is curious, and admits to not having all the answers. And this is really the new kind of leader that we see businesses looking for. Businesses want people now who have these characteristics. And this has been one of the biggest changes in the last 20 years, particularly through the drive in innovation in artificial intelligence and in programming, et cetera, data collection, data analysis, looking for people who know how to ask the right questions. So again, we think that we can answer all questions by searching, right? Our initial response to any problem is that we get online, we sit down, and we Google it, right? This is the normal response. And if you ask the question, is the internet making us more stupid or more intelligent? The answer is yes, it's both. Why? Because the more information that there is, the lazier we become, right? But at the same time, we have access to more information, and therefore we have this kind of double-edged sword. We're becoming less and less curious, while at the same time having access to knowledge. So the most powerful illusion that we have right now is that all questions have definite answers. And if you think about innovation in that way, innovation comes from not knowing the answer, and maybe the answer has actually never been tried before. In other words, if you were to go online, there are essentially two things on the internet that you can't find. The first is answers to questions that have yet to be asked, and the second is new ideas. In other words, if you're trying to create something that has never been created before and never been done before, you're obviously not going to find the answer to that. The internet can only tell you what we already know. So, do all people have the same level of curiosity? As we talked about before, curiosity is a muscle. So we all possess curiosity, but we lose it after childhood, or many of us lose it, and some of us actually maintain it. So we're entering into a period of time when we can say that there's something called the curiosity divide. The curiosity divide means that you have one group of society, one group of workers, one group of designers, creators who maintain their curiosity, and then you have another group who are very satisfied with the status quo. So they want to continue on with things as they've always been done. And so we have this divergence right now. And for those of you, for example, who are considering going and or have committed to going and doing future studies, you are part of the curious. You are part of that group of people who have said, I want to learn more. I want to explore. I want to open my horizons. And so you are on the track to being a part of the curious, right? So our world right now is upside down. Everything that we knew before has suddenly changed. Everything has flip-flopped. Instead of working in an office, now you're working from home. Instead of eating out, now maybe you're cooking. Maybe you had plans to travel this summer, and suddenly those plans have changed. So everything in our universe has suddenly flipped upside down. We're in this 2-meter economy, right? For the first time in human history, suddenly we have to maintain 2 meters. I can tell you in Spain, which is such a social environment, this idea of a 2-meter economy is just mind-boggling for us, right? So what happens? So right now you have essentially two different kinds of companies. You have those companies that are able to pivot, which can survive, and those companies which are unable to pivot or don't possess the curiosity to innovate. So what does it mean to pivot? Pivot is essentially a term it's become a buzzword referring to a significant business change, ranging from mild to dramatic. A pivot is usually intended to help a business recover from a tough period or survive after experiencing new competition or other factors that make the original business model unsustainable. So pivot is the ability to move and to change direction, to adapt, right? And so that takes us back to human adaptation. Right now, pivoting for companies, for individuals, is the key to survival. Those companies that don't pivot right now are in a survival crisis mode, and many of those will perish, right? Those that do pivot will survive. So if we look right now, what are the opportunities for innovation that we have in this very moment? Those are, first of all, we've seen innovation in terms of fighting the pandemic, right? So some companies, maybe companies that used to produce textiles, well, all of a sudden they've geared up to produce protective equipment for nurses and doctors, right? So the first kind is to fight the pandemic. The second is adapting to quarantine life. And so we have many companies that have suddenly shifted. For example, we were talking about restaurants. Well, many restaurants have suddenly shifted to home delivery. The third kind of innovation that we see right now is reinventing hard hit industries. And essentially what that means is that those industries that are most hard hit right now, they need to adapt in order to survive into the future. And out of all of this, what we're going to have is life after the coronavirus. And that's going to be the new normal. So this combination of four areas of innovation is where this new normal is actually going to come from, right? So if we look at a company like Decathlon is a French company that manufactures and sells sporting gear, sporting equipment. Well, they have these masks, and these masks are essentially designed for snorkeling, right? Well, during the pandemic, they were trying to think of how they could pivot, and they suddenly came up with this idea that those snorkeling masks could actually be used to create respirators, right? So respirators were suddenly, in huge shortage around the world. Well, Decathlon pivoted and began to manufacture and sell these masks that they had and adapt them to this new environment. So those companies that roll with the punches, as we say, innovate and make the best of the situation will come out on top, right? Now, the important thing here is what questions are the right questions that we should be asking right now? In other words, if you were the CEO of a company, what questions would you ask in order for your company to be able to adapt and survive? If we think about companies in this way, companies are not answers. Companies, although they possess answers, but they possess them, but companies originate as questions. So Facebook is actually not an answer. Facebook is a question, and it's a question that emerged if you've seen the movie, the question that emerged in the dorm room when they were inventing Facebook was, what would happen if we put people's identities online and each person could have their own identity? Well, that was the original question. What would happen if, right? And so that's where the innovation comes from. Uber is not an answer. Uber is a question. Uber is an answer to the question, why can only taxi drivers drive people around? Why can't anybody who have a car do it, right? And so that out of that emerges the new idea. Airbnb is not an answer. Airbnb is a question. Why can only hotels rent out their rooms? Why can't anybody who has a room rent it out? What if we created a platform where people could do that, right? And so that's the way we can look at all companies, and all innovations are in terms of them being questions and not just answers. So let's look at what's happening right now. If we think about pivoting, right? So if we look back in the last 10 years or so, what we see is that telecommuting has been growing around the world, and working in an office has slowly been decreasing, right? So these two things have been changing. Well, what happened is 2020 comes along, all of a sudden everybody is forced to work at home, right? And so telecommuting shoots up, office work drops to almost zero, right? And what do you have? You have a pivot. And what is the pivot? All of a sudden, everybody is using Zoom, right? They're making Zoom calls, Zoom meetings. I'm on Zoom right now. I'm recording this session on Zoom. And so the pivot comes when that sudden change occurs. If we look at online education, online education has been growing in the last 10 years, and classroom education has at the same time been decreasing. Well, what happened when we hit 2020 is that all of a sudden online education has spiked or skyrocketed, and classroom education has suddenly dropped to zero, as we're not able to actually be in a classroom together. Now, we're going to come out of all of these different situations. In other words, we're going to go back to some relative situation, which is like the normal that we had before. But obviously, these new normals that we're creating, these new situations, these new innovations, and these new pivots are going to continue into our future, right? So, innovation. How can you look at innovation? I've broken up the opportunities into a couple different areas. The first thing is to keep your customers loyal. In other words, whatever customers you had before this crisis happened, what you want to do is you want to try to keep them, right? And so the first focus of any effort, of any innovation would be, how do I keep my customers loyal to my company? The second is to adjust to new customer habits. If all of these social, cultural, economic changes are happening, how can I adapt to this new lifestyle that people now have and they will continue to have? One of the questions, by the way, that I always ask I ask my clients right now is, what are the biggest problems that you're facing right now? What are the biggest problems that your clients are facing? And they answer that question. And then the second question I ask them is, how long do you think that's going to last? And what's fascinating is that 100% of the people who I have spoken to have the same question, which is the same answer, which is, I don't know. In other words, we know that all of these problems exist, but we don't know. Is it going to be 3 months or 6 months or a year? When are these situations going to begin to go back to some semblance of normal? Nobody has any idea, right? So the third thing we can do is actually to rethink the customer experience and the customer journey. And that's a very important thing in terms of the hospitality industry, because obviously the hospitality industry, flying, travel, staying in hotels, staying in Airbnb, restaurants, et cetera, those industries have been incredibly hard hit by this new situation. So, what would this new customer experience be like? How would I convince people to come back into my restaurant? How would I convince people to feel comfortable enough and safe enough to come back into my hotel? What kind of a journey, experience, communication, et cetera, can I do, which will actually give people that kind of confidence, right? So, if we look at the innovations that have happened during quarantine life, for example, everyone has been watching Netflix. Well, Netflix realized that people used to go to the movies, and now everyone was sitting at home, and so they created this thing called Netflix Party. And Netflix Party, what it allows you to do is watch a movie or a series with someone else who can be anywhere else in the world. You watch it at the same time, and while you're watching it, you chat with each other. You can maintain a conversation. So they knew that everyone was at home, but that everyone still had this desire for social contact. So they created this innovation in order to give people the solution to that particular problem. Another example is Flex Hotels. So Flex Hotels, this is a company that provides two-man hotel rooms, which they use for festivals and events around Europe. So where there would be like a music festival, they would set up these little hotel rooms where two people could sleep, but they could set them up anywhere. Well, what they did was they realized that right now one of the biggest problems that people have is going and visiting their parents or their grandparents in a residence, right? Because they don't want to infect someone who's high risk right now. So what Flex Hotels did is they adapted their business model to providing people in residences with the opportunity to sit down with their mother or father or grandmother or grandfather or whomever it is, but in a protective environment. So they took the knowledge and the technology that they had, and they pivoted it to the current situation. And so the company, which was just about to go bankrupt, has suddenly prospered again. This is an example from something that we've done. So we work a lot with jewelers and high-end watch and jewelry companies. And one of our clients is called Chocron Jewelry, Chocron Joyeros in Spain. And they suddenly had this problem, which is that nobody wanted to go out to the boutiques. People are afraid to go shopping in a boutique. So we realized that what people really want when they shop for a luxury product, people want to have that personalized experience. They want to be able to ask lots of questions. They want to be able to see the product in great detail. So what we did was we built for them essentially a platform. It's essentially an audio visual set with multiple cameras, professional lighting, HD cameras, sound, which are all connected to the computer. And what this does is it allows them to make a multi-camera Zoom call to a client where they can actually show a watch or a ring, a piece of jewelry in incredible high definition and maintain that same personalized experience that they've always done. And so they pivoted in this way to create an experience which meets the demand and meets the problems and answers the questions that are being asked right now. So if we look at the world with all of this, what we've been talking about, what are the knowns, what are the unknowns, and what are the unknown unknowns about your future right now? Now you can settle down and wait for this new normal to come and see what it's going to be, right? Or you can actually become a part of creating it in whatever field you're in, whatever area of interest you have. You can be a part of that by exercising your curiosity. So the important thing that I think we need to look at right now is, what are the questions that we should be asking about our future? What are the questions that will take us out into these unknown unknowns? And those questions almost always begin with the words, what if? What if we did this? What if we did that? How about if we tried this, right? And so when we begin to ask those kinds of open-ended questions, that's where we begin to get these new ideas. So essentially, what we want to look at right now is, how can you pivot? How can you, as an individual, pivot? If you work in an organization or a company, how can your company pivot? Certainly, at IE University as a professor, I have been challenged in this exact same way. And so a liquid learning lab is essentially a way of pivoting what we do in a classroom, right, to an online experience that has all the elements that a classroom experience has, but it is in this new environment, in this new methodology. It's pivoting what we do to a new situation and a new reality. So what are we going to do now? So as this liquid learning lab moves forward, I'd like you to do 4 different things. You've watched the video. Now what I'd like you to do is pick up the case study, which has been sent to you. It'll take you about 3 minutes to read through the case study. You'll see that it's very, very short and very clear. What I'd like you to do is, within that, you'll see that there are a few articles which I have included about the hospitality industry. I'd like you to look at those articles, and that's going to give you some kind of background information. That'll take you about 15 minutes. They're all short articles. And the last thing is that I've posted within the case study, I've posted a few questions, and I'd like you to look at those questions and jot down some ideas and notes about what you would do if you were the CEO of a hospitality company. Could be Airbnb, maybe a hotel company. What are the kinds of questions that you would be asking right now? What are the kinds of solutions that you might come up with for your company to pivot? And then what we're going to do is, we're going to get together in the online session, and we're going to have a discussion. So everyone will come with their ideas, thoughts, questions, etc. And that way we can have a really exciting conversation. And I encourage you to bring your enthusiasm and your ideas to that session. So I'd like to end with a kind of a blessing for you, which is, may you never stop getting excited by what you don't know. And some of you might recognize this particular vehicle is actually the Mars rover that they've built to explore the planet Mars, and they named the Mars rover Curiosity. So the future, of course, belongs to the curious. I thank you so much for your time and your attention. If you'd like to connect with me, Brian Hallett with 2 L's and 2 T's. I'm on Instagram at Brian Hallett Eyes. I'm also on LinkedIn. You're welcome to write to me, connect with me before or after the session. So I'd like to thank you so much for being here today. I hope that this has been interesting and inspiring for you. I hope that you see the current time as not so much of a crisis, but as a moment of opportunity. And I really look forward to seeing you in our online session. Again, bring your enthusiasm, bring your ideas and your questions, and we will see what kind of a conversation we can generate there. Thank you so much. Be safe, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and I will see you soon. Thank you so much.